What are your thoughts when I say behaviour-based safety? Across the safety literature, behaviour-based safety, or BBS, is often presented as a practical way to improve outcomes. It's fair to say it's a divisive topic between behavioural proponents and those from the so-called New View or Hopkins philosophies, and more. Instead of trying to resolve this debate, I can't, but I want to provide a fairly balanced overview of the state of science and some of the key arguments in support of and challenging behavioural logics. To do this, I've cherry-picked multiple studies of the hundreds of available studies. Anyway, g'day everyone, welcome to Safe As. I'm Dr. Ben Hutchinson. Several of the studies we'll cover today highlight both the potential benefits and some of the methodological, organisational and ethical constraints that shape whether BBS helps or simply shifts attention to fixing people rather than the organisational factors that create the risk to begin with. First, what is BBS? At its core, BBS is a structured way of changing the way work is done by focusing on specific behaviours. It involves identifying critical observable behaviours linked to injury risk, establishing a baseline, and then having trained observers, often workers themselves, observe work and then give supportive, non-punitive feedback. Those observations are aggregated and trended not to blame individuals, but to learn where conditions, tools or systems are shaping behaviour. And as argued by some, when done well, it's somewhat of an administrative control designed to complement, not replace, engineering and systems level safety controls. So, study 1 from Hopkins, what are we to make of safe behaviour programs? Published in the National Research Centre for OHS Regulation at the ANU. Hopkins starts with a really apt reflection. Many safe behaviour programs rely on frontline workers observing colleagues and feeding back what they see, sometimes one-on-one and sometimes via counts and trend reports. His core argument is that these programs can fall into what he calls the fallacy of modern causality, which is treating unsafe behaviour as the cause worth addressing when unsafe behaviour is often the last link in a longer causal chain. Instead, he unpacks the multi-causal thinking by walking backwards into the causal chain, from an unsafe act to the upstream drivers like design choices, production pressures, and management decisions, arguing that once you ask why the unsafe act occurred, causal chains often implicate management and system conditions. And my own interjection, James Reason has this rather beautiful reflection on the role of people in large complex failures. That is, rather than being the main instigators of an accident, operators tend to be the inheritors of system defects created by poor design, incorrect installation and bad management decisions. Hopkins also emphasises the hierarchy of controls. Behavioural programs often target the lower end, like rules or PPE, which are less reliable than eliminating or engineering out hazards. In barrier, energy and critical control frameworks, there are specific criteria for what constitutes human intervention. I don't have time to unpack these, but check out my site and the podcasts as I've covered these multiple times. Nevertheless, a key insight is that these programs may systematically miss rare but critical behaviours like particular workarounds during breakdowns or shutdowns. And they might miss behaviours that are not observable to the naked eye, such as like permit to work failures or isolation errors. Permit to work problems in the Piper Alpha disaster might be a really good example. An absence of bad news about the process was interpreted as the system is working. Hopkins argues that frontline focused approaches also can't address accidents driven by latent conditions where frontline acts are not the immediate proximal causes. Finally, Hopkins says effectiveness is conditional. These programs sometimes work and sometimes they don't. And a major differentiator is trust between the workforce and management. Where distrust dominates, he argues employers should repair underlying issues before expecting behavioural programs to succeed. The next study is from Spiegel et al. 2022 titled Behaviour-Based Safety, Today's Evidence, Journal of Organisational Behaviour Management. This paper has two goals. Evaluate whether BBS reduces injuries and improves safety culture, whatever that is, and identify which design components strengthen BBS effectiveness. Using data from 88 sites and over 1.3 million observations, all implemented via a commercial program, mind you, the authors report modelled injury reductions averaging 25% after year 1, 34% by year 2, and 42% after the third year. So, according to their data, BBS programs are effective for these types of measures. Their core findings challenge some common assumptions. They report that the greatest injury reduction occurred at a moderate observation rate, about 16 to 65 observations per 100 employees per month, suggesting that more observations aren't necessarily better in this data set. They report that higher percentages of employees acting as observers were associated with less improvement in their data, while noting constraints about how high participation actually was across their sample. Further report that rotating observers, rather than keeping the same people in the role indefinitely, is more effective. And their guideline table states rotation typically every 3 to 12 months is probably appropriate. Finally, they find observations were more effective when observers focus on tasks in their own area, rather than crossing boundaries for a fresh pair of eyes. And that using a small number of structured comment sort of flags, like 1 or 2 flags, to capture context appears more effective than using none or multiple flags or prompts. Linking these findings back to Hopkins, Hopkins warned that focusing on readily observable behaviours can miss deeper hazards. Spigner et al. In this study primarily address this by emphasising quality and context like task familiarity and contextual flags, rather than just the volume of the inspection. But BBS isn't a single, stable, monolithic concept across many decades. To understand why BBS looks different across multiple organisations and authors, the next paper provides a conceptual history. So third is from Jean-Christophe Lecoz in 2026, titled The Untold Story of Behaviour-Based Safety. This is from the extended version of Safety Science. Lecoz argues that despite BBS's influence and controversy, there hasn't really been any published conceptual and critical history of the tradition. This paper really aimed to remedy that by tracing key texts from the 1970s up until now. Methodologically, the paper reports analysing around 20 books and something like 30 articles, spanning both academic and consultancy work. And you find consultancy published articles a lot in BBS. The central conclusion is that BBS is not monolithic. While early BBS drew from Skinner-influenced behaviorism, Skinner being a behaviorist psychologist whose operant conditioning treats behaviour as shaped by its environment, its consequences, which like reinforcement and punishment learning. You know, if you want a dog or a person to shake, then you keep feeding him biscuits. But importantly, later developments diverged into 3 orientations in the BBS field. 1, the classical traditional, which is associated with Solzer. 2, the theoretical inspirational, which is associated with people like Geller. And 3, organisational critical, which is associated with Krauss. Lecoz also summarises an early rationale and principles set from BBS, including a 10-step style program model, but emphasises that later authors reinterpreted the role of management, organisational conditions, and the behaviour-accident relationship in different ways. As highlighted by the likes of Scott Geller and Tom Krauss, who are non-BBS traditionalists, behaviour is the result of leadership, culture, system and facility design not being the central driver itself. That is, behaviour isn't the end into itself. So as mentioned in Lecoz's article, the starting point for improving safety lies not in behaviours, but the organisation. And importantly, despite critics pointing out some questionable and maybe myopic applications of behavioural safety, it's argued that the most visible authors producing the main practical and academic BBS texts and analysed in this study never fully advocate such myopic, mechanistic applications of behaviour. Actually, all of them promote systems views in some sense, leadership, management, context, the environment. So most of these BBS authors support a proactive, positive and non-punitive view of safe performance. And I urge people, check out some of Scott Geller's work. You might forget you're not reading a Hop-inspired text. And indeed, as highlighted by Krauss, the popularity of BBS led to inconsistent practices on the safety market by a variety of poor consulting or half-digested rationale and principles by different companies, which could happen with any concept really. But this led to a lot of cynicism and caution towards BBS. Fourth is from Kara et al. 2024, titled Implementation of Behaviour-Based Safety in the Workplace, a review of conceptual and empirical literature, published in Sustainability. Kara and colleagues in their literature review present BBS is increasingly implemented and argue that the boundaries between standard BBS and related interventions can be quite blurry. They reviewed 230 articles from the 70s up to about 2023. They describe typical BBS implementation steps as a baseline analysis, intervention, which is like feedback supported by observation, post-intervention analysis using KPIs and sometimes a withdrawal or reversal phase, where you take the intervention away and see if behaviour goes back or regresses, and a few other steps. They also outline foundations in behavioural psychology and the ABC model, and describe historical evolution from supervisory observation approaches to more employee-led approaches and later cultural partnership approaches. In their synthesis of success factors, they repeatedly highlight the importance of trust and communication, worker involvement, active manager or supervisor support, and the role of safety culture or climate. Not surprisingly, stable findings across most domains of safety research, including HOP philosophies and many others, also find the same things. They also describe recurring criticisms in the implementation, including privacy concerns, the risk of blaming workers or overburdening them, as well as underreporting and the challenge of rare, high-consequence risks. So these issues are well known to BBS proponents. My interjection? This is a common counter-argument from behavioural proponents, that the core issues of BBS aren't structural to behavioural safety. They're more related to the design, the implementation, and the resourcing of BBS approaches, or more specifically, their misuse. Finally, their stated outlook is that future BBS variants will integrate traditional observation positive feedback with technology and broader organisational involvement and attention to worker and workplace differences. So more of that contemporary systems view. The fifth study is from Tunzel et al. 2006, titled Effectiveness of Behaviour-Based Safety Interventions to Reduce Accidents and Injuries in Workplaces, published in Theoretical Issues in Ergonomic Science, and this was a meta-analysis. Tunzel and colleagues set to do two things. They undertook a meta-analysis of the BBS studies as of 2006 and look at the effects on accident and injury outcomes. So since it's an older study, obviously it's missed a lot of research until now. For their results, they state 8 studies achieved statistically significant accident or injury reductions, and they report an overall effect size estimate indicating statistical significance, while also noting there's a lot of differences in the studies and how they measured these sorts of improvements and their BBS interventions. So they're quite different. And these differences make direct comparison a bit more challenging. Crucially, they warn that statistical significance should be interpreted cautiously because most of the studies lacked comparison groups, raising the possibility that the observed reductions could be due to other factors. Things like regression to the mean, Hawthorne effect, random chance and more could be one of the critical determinants of the findings. They also note that there are known reporting distortions, so minor injuries may go unreported when monetary rewards depend on months without accident. In my interjection, studies from probes suggest that up to 80% of incidents go unreported. So we have very little reason to trust reported incident injury data, at least for the more minor potential events. Nevertheless, their future direction section calls for stronger designs. Workplace need better assessments, comparable control groups, better reporting of sample size and participation rates, accounting for confounders, and investigating validity and reliability of measurement. So while this paper did find overall benefits to BBS, they do caution that because of the weak study designs, this really complements Hopkins' critique that focusing on behaviour can maybe obscure some upstream causes, because weak designs can't rule out those upstream drivers as alternate explanations. It also complements Kara's observation that long-term effectiveness and measurement quality remain recurring issues. But I'll come back to this discussion around the state of the evidence. Now, a 6th bonus article that throws a cat amongst the pigeons. It's an article from Sydney Decker on the safetydifferently.com site called The Original Hearts and Minds Campaign and the Dereliction of Behaviour-Based Safety. It's not peer-reviewed, of course. Decker argues measurement pressure distorts reality. He uses the original Hearts and Minds campaign to argue that what gets measured can be manipulated, especially when leaders demand simple progress graphs and simple measures. He argues that the Hearts and Minds label is often used to justify behavioural programs that redirect attention away from leadership and towards workers as the problem. He describes typical BBS as defining correct behaviours, training, measuring compliance and rewarding compliance, which might include elements of surveillance and coaching. He argues that we shouldn't target behaviour per se. We should, wherever possible, target the conditions under which behaviour occurs. Aim change at whatever is responsible for creating those conditions. But importantly, if you watch my recent YouTube interview with Decker, you can see he broadly supports the view from some prominent BBS authors like Geller and Tom Krause, that behaviour should be understood wherever possible. First, from the organisational contextual factors, rather than simply as the end to itself. And the seventh and final bonus article is from Williams and Roberts, 2018, titled A Holistic Approach to Improving Safety Performance, published in Professional Safety. The authors argue that BBS and new review sort of HOP are compatible and should be treated as complementary, not competing approaches. Both can support safe work practices and safety system improvements. They emphasize that system factors like faulty equipment, production pressure, overtime, drive much of the risky behavior or human error and resulting injuries. Therefore, the first question after an injury should be, where did the system fail? They outline HOP tools that operationalize learning and error prevention before or after the work. For instance, pre-job briefings, 2-minute analysis, self or peer checking, timeouts, post-job briefings, etc. And this can be used to identify error traps and error-likely situations and strengthen the risk control defenses. They frame BBS as identifying critical behaviors, analyzing why risk behavior occurs, then using supportive, corrective, and barrier removal or system modification techniques. They stress limited blame and non-punitive measures should be used as part of the observation checklists and then using trend data to drive system fixes. But they also caution that organizations often jump between programs like the flavor of the month, creating siloed initiatives and fatigue. Instead, we should integrate the best elements of all these approaches into one coherent system. Some useful takeaways from this Williams and Roberts article was, we should stop treating BBS and HOP as binary choices. And mature BBS approaches are broader than just checklists and behavior. It includes leadership behaviors, system improvements, person states, communication, not just observing people. And I do wonder, does this involve observing the leaders? If they're the ones that create most of these risks to begin with, do behavioral observations need to check and sit into board meetings? If you read some of Scott Geller's work, like I mentioned before, you might be surprised if you're from this HOP element, just how much alignment there is. They also suggest human error as a signal, not a conclusion. HOP framing described here treats error as the starting point for analyzing system weaknesses and strengthening defenses. Obviously, non-punitive and limited blame and respectful communication are presented as essential features for any approach. Again, avoid the flavor of the month. They warn that cycling new initiatives without integration creates skepticism and confusion, which is really harmful to the uptake of any safety philosophy. Okay, that's a lot of data. And before I move into some takeaways from the articles, I want to reflect on my own thoughts. I think there's actually more in common between BBS and some of these new view or HOP philosophies than some of us want to admit. Now, we might have different units of analysis, like BBS is interested in behavior, or they might use some very mechanistic terms like unsafe versus safe behavior, which depends on the observer, but fundamentally, we're all interested in work. When you look at modern human factors applications of task analysis, critical control verifications under ICMM and the like, or construction hazard and control verification approaches like the TR method, I think you can begin to see the overlaps and complementary natures. We're interested in work, but we have different units of analysis to describe it. My thoughts. While I've never been a strong proponent of BBS itself, I don't see why we'd want to limit our options, our adaptive toolboxes, for an approach that, regardless of your worldview and political orientations, does have a substantial body of evidence behind it, limitations included. This doesn't mean every idea and concept should be given equal weight, because some concepts just have poor evidence behind them. But on the other side, we also can't ignore the large empirical and industrial tests and uses of BBS. Can we trust the injury measures used in these studies and articles? Maybe, maybe not. That depends entirely on the individual studies and the pooled effects, etc. And recognizing the generally consistent findings that the overall body of BBS research is relatively weak in methodology, limits of the studies, I still think it's hard to argue that the burden of evidence hasn't shifted from those that promote BBS, shifted to those that reject it. That is, while critical challenges exist and are valid to the validity of BBS research, as with all research and bodies of evidence, I think the onus has actually shifted to the critics to demonstrate these approaches aren't achieving their core goals or are resulting in significant unintended consequences, as many argue. Are BBS approaches really shifting the focus to minor potential hazards away from process and high energy hazards? Are they driving reporting underground? Are they impacting trust and reporting? I think we're at the point where these challenges are interesting, but we need empirical evidence to back them up. Nevertheless, prominent authors like Geller and Krauss have been promoting a proactive system focus for decades. So we can't group all BBS together, nor should we probably group it into the same basket as some of the more mechanistic consulting applications, which mind you applies for HOP also. They're still mechanistic applications of HOP. So, what can we make of the findings? Overall, BBS effectiveness is scientifically plausible, but the impacts are conditional, of course. Large data sets and meta-analyses do report injury and incident reductions, but multiple sources stress that the results depend on the context, design, and the study quality. Overall, the strength of the studies are relatively weak, but we have enough of them to give us a general direction. Methodological rigor is a recurring gap across the research. So, for instance, Tunstall stress poor to marginal study quality and call for stronger controls and measurement validity, noting that was from 2006. And as with other research, the long-term effects of behavioural interventions are relatively limited, but it does exist. And importantly, Dominic Cooper has cautioned that BBS was never meant as a process safety intervention. It was intentionally personal safety. So some of the criticism around avoiding major hazards may not be fair. The code shows BBS has multiple orientations, which help explain why BBS can look different across different organizations and decades. We should design BBS so it doesn't substitute for higher order controls. It should run alongside hazard elimination, engineering, and high energy applications if you're going to use it. We should critically challenge whether you really have widespread behavioral issues or whether you have an organizational issue manifesting through behavior. As argued by Decker, human error problems might be more organizational issues. And then the importance of trust and restorative culture conditions matter. Hopkins and Carrot and Decker explicitly elevate trust and warn about blame dynamics. We should combine HOP tools and BBS observation and feedback so you capture context, identify error traps, close the loop with learning and feedback. I think the critical control verification artifacts are probably a sound place to do a lot of this. And previously I mentioned the TR method, which is really useful too. If you use BBS and maybe reflect on the cards, on the observations you use, maybe to have more systems and condition factors, add prompts about tools, equipment, availability, production pressure, leadership, and other conditions. So observations drive system fixes, not just behavior correction. Beware what's missed. Hopkins highlights blind spots, which are rare critical behaviors and latent conditions, which may be invisible to behavioral observations. We have to make sure to protect psychological safety and interpersonal risk-taking, make observation feedback systems explicitly non-punitive, and watch for privacy concerns and under-reporting incentives. We need to prioritize the quality of observations and task analysis, task familiarity, meaningful feedback, and this needs to be prioritized over quotas and paperwork. Build mechanisms to surface non-obvious and rare high-consequence risks, which could be things like permit-to-work systems, shutdowns, and other latent factors in the organization. And we have to move away just from the visible PPE and housekeeping issues.